Yeah, let's go ahead and get started. Hey, everybody, welcome to our Spaces session. Here, we're going to be talking about our latest episode with Nick, first episode of the second season. My name is Kirk McDaniel. I am Sidebar's producer, and I was very grateful, very thankful to get to produce this past episode with some amazing reporting from Nick. Nick, go ahead, introduce yourself, and we can get started.
Hi, everyone. I'm Nick Iovino. I'm the reporter at Courthouse News for San Francisco Bay Area. And I mostly cover the federal court here in San Francisco, which is how I heard of one of these cases that we're going to talk about today, which was Maurice Caldwell, who had filed a federal civil lawsuit against the city of San Francisco.
Awesome. Well, let's go ahead and get started. And tell me a little bit about both these gentlemen, Mr. Vanderhorst and Mr. Caldwell. Tell us a little bit about their stories. Kind of summarize what your reporting covered.
Sure. Well, what these two men have in common is they were both uh, young black men who grew up in the projects of San Francisco, different projects. Both got involved with drugs at a young age and also were arrested for crimes they did not commit at a young age and served decades in prison. Maurice Caldwell grew up in the Alamany projects, which is in kind of south uh, eastern San Francisco, at the height of a crack cocaine epidemic. In 1991, at age 23, he was convicted of murdering a man in a botched drug deal that occurred 1 year earlier in 1990. No physical evidence linked him to the crime, but he was found guilty based on the testimony of one eyewitness. Her story, she has since passed away, and her story has been discredited by studies that showed she couldn't have witnessed the crime in the way she described it to jurors. The more interesting aspect of Caldwell's story is he claims that a narcotics officer who he had a beef with. This narcotics officer, Kit Crenshaw, was accused of assaulting Caldwell in January 1990. Caldwell had filed a complaint against him. And then 6 months later, when this murder investigation was occurring, uh, Caldwell claims that Crenshaw falsified a statement that made him the number one murder suspect and that he presented him to the witness before an official lineup, which made the witness, I guess, more likely to um, pick him out and say that he was the one who committed the crime. The witness was also given benefits in exchange for her testimony, um, which Caldwell's lawyers say, you know, made her more susceptible to police pressure to identify him. For Zachary Vanderhorst, um, he grew up in the 70s. His case occurred some almost 2 decades earlier, or maybe 16, 17 years earlier, 1974. He was he grew up in the Fillmore projects of San Francisco, and at age 19, he had become addicted to heroin, and uh, he basically that got him. A friend convinced him to help him rob a house because Vanderhorst was going through heroin withdrawal and basically was compelled to commit this crime because of his addiction. But while he was helping a friend rob a house, his friend shot and killed a man. Vanderhorst was later arrested for this crime that his friend committed and charged not only with murder, but two other robberies and a rape that occurred months earlier in July. Um, his public defenders didn't investigate his alibi or his story at the time. They pressured him to plead guilty, telling him he could get the death penalty if he did not plead guilty. So he ended up serving 45 years in prison before his convictions were overturned, and Caldwell served 20 years in prison.
Wow. Well, and you had said that you had discovered one of these stories through your coverage of the federal court system there in San Francisco, correct?
Yes,
Which story was that one?
Maurice Caldwell, because he filed a civil lawsuit against the San Francisco, and he that was settled last year for $8 million.
Well, and how did you come about Mr. Vanderhorst's story?
I was made aware of that in October of last year by a press release from the public defender's office. And I was just taken aback when I saw it because it said this man had served 45 years in prison for crimes he didn't commit. And I mean, that's someone's entire life almost. He got out of prison at age 64. And I was surprised actually that not a lot of publications picked up that story. But I was already had been kind of working on getting an interview with Maurice Caldwell at the time. And I thought this sounds like another important story to cover as well.
Mhm. Well, tell me a little bit about sort of the system. You know, I know for Mr. Vanderhorst, there were California laws that enabled his incarceration. But kind of tell me a little bit about state laws or maybe even federal laws that enabled this to happen for these men to be incarcerated for such an extended period of time for crimes they did not commit.
Right. Well, that more so applies to Zachary Vanderhorst's case because he was arrested for felony murder, and even though he didn't kill anyone or intend to kill anyone, he was unarmed at this robbery. He was in the front living room wrapping up a TV set when his friend shot and killed someone on the back porch. And because of a law that has since been reformed. It was reformed in 2018. Uh, a person could be convicted of murder, uh, even if they did not kill or intend to kill anyone. If they, took part in a crime where a killing occurred. So if you take part in some felony like a robbery where someone gets killed, even if you had nothing to do with the murder, um, you can still be convicted of murder. And that was the law at the time in California, and that's why he was facing the death penalty under that law. Um, although I think I'm not. Although I think they might have tried to say that he was the one who committed the crime, but um, even if a jury had believed him that he had not been the person who shot the gun, he could still be convicted and serve life in prison for murder, having not killed anyone. When that law was reformed in 2018, he was able to apply for resentencing, and that's how the uh, public defender's office became aware of his case, and his public defender, Rebecca Young, um, found out that he had also been pressured to plead guilty to these other crimes that he didn't commit. And the last of those convictions were overturned in December last year.
Well, could you tell me a little bit about maybe parts of this story that you learned? You know, here at Courthouse News, we cover so much about the legal world. Um, and I think talking about exonerations is one of those aspects of covering the legal world. Was there anything that you had learned in this process of reporting this story, that something that surprised you? Maybe laws that are on the books that maybe people are working to get rid of that enable things like this to happen, or just maybe parts of the law enforcement process that led to these two men losing years of life with their families.
Well, one thing is, and I mean, this has been talked about for many years now, is the how unreliable witness testimony and witness identifications can be. Most wrongful convictions stem from these, convictions that were purely based on, a witness saying someone did something, because memories can be unreliable. People can make mistakes. That's what happened in the case of Maurice Caldwell. He was convicted based solely on the testimony of this one witness. And then for Zachary Vanderhorst, he was identified in a lineup. And that's what led to him being prosecuted for murder. But in the subsequent investigation that his public defenders did decades later, they found that the assailants in the robbery were wearing masks, and no one really knew what they looked like, and he didn't match the description that was initially given of the suspect. There were some major problems with the police investigations. I know Caldwell's lawyer they found an expert who kind of looked into police practices and concluded that that police did not, investigate. They did not put as many resources into investigating murders that took place in the projects, murders that involved Black men or were minorities, or Black people were the victims. Another thing is Caldwell claims that Crenshaw is the reason he was prosecuted, because he set him up to be the number one suspect. And, Caldwell had filed a complaint against that officer who I spoke to, and you can hear him respond to the accusations against him in the piece. But he never faced any repercussions. Evidence presented in the lawsuit showed that he had more than 60 complaints filed against him over his career. And although the Office of Citizen Complaints, which investigates those complaints, recommended that claims against him, charges be sustained, he never faced any disciplinary action. So another thing they found was that basically the officer discipline system was completely flawed and not working.
I see. Well, tell me a little bit more about your interview with Officer Kit Crenshaw. I understand that he's quite well known there in the San Francisco Bay Area, and your interview with him for the piece sounded quite intense. How did you get that interview, and what was it like talking to him?
Well, I think I reached out to him on Facebook, actually. I was not expecting him to agree to sit down with me for an interview, but he did. He actually lives in Las Vegas now, but he was going to be in town in San Francisco, and we were able to meet up. And he sat down for a audio recorded interview, and it was intense because there are so many serious claims against him in this lawsuit, that he choked and assaulted Maurice Caldwell, that he falsified a statement, and that he presented him to this witness to make him more likely that he'd be identified as the murder suspect. I should also mention that someone else has since confessed to that murder that Caldwell was convicted of. But Officer Crenshaw still does not believe that Caldwell is innocent. And I guess it was just interesting to hear he basically had a response for everything. The complaints against him, he said, well, he was very active on the streets making arrests, and more active officers have more complaints filed against them. He denied claims that he used to regularly harass and stop and search Caldwell for no reason. He said he had no interactions with Caldwell prior to this January 1990 incident where he's accused of driving him to a dark alley and assaulting him because he wanted him to reveal the location of a gun. Basically, they were chasing some young men in the projects who were suspected of shooting out streetlights in that incident. So yes, he denied everything. And anyway, do you have any other questions?
Yeah, I did have one more sort of on this same thread. I'm curious for Mr. Vanderhorst or for Mr. Caldwell. Has the city of San Francisco, has anyone given, like, say, a formal apology or a sort of addressed the inadequacies of the sort of trial that they received and the treatment that they received while they were in prison?
No. In fact, in the case of Caldwell, it's the exact opposite. I mean, after the settlement was reached, the city attorney's office released a statement saying, this does not prove any fault, that they even um, note that they wanted to retry Caldwell for murder, but couldn't because the witness had passed away. And they said some some records from the original trial had been destroyed. And yeah, in their statement, the city attorney's office says that that Caldwell has never been found innocent, and that the officer did nothing wrong by taking a statement from Caldwell. So yeah, the city has not apologized or admitted any fault. It even maintains that Caldwell still isn't innocent, even though someone else um, confessed to the crime. Officer Crenshaw says that that person is a friend of Caldwell's. Um, According to Caldwell, they are not friends. They kind of had a falling out, and that person is now serving life uh, in a Nevada prison for murder, a murder he committed after the 1990 shooting. And Caldwell says if they had arrested the real killer back then another life might have been saved because he wouldn't have been able to kill again.
I see. In reporting on these two stories, did you ever come across other instances of this happening in, say, the state of California, the Bay Area, or even just elsewhere in the country? Did you come across many other stories like this?
Yes, well, there were a lot of things I didn't get to include in the piece because, I had limited time and couldn't cover everything. But there were several wrongful convictions that occurred around the same time, in the early 90s. At least two or three other men have were released, had their convictions overturned for things that happened somewhere between like 1989 and into the early 90s. And most of them have received settlements from the city. So, yes, I mean, a lot of people point to that as evidence that there were some serious problems with the San Francisco Police Department, the way it investigated murders, specifically happening in the projects, and also with the criminal justice system in San Francisco at that time.
Mm, wow. And has that been anything that the city has um, addressed or has acknowledged of a past inadequacies?
Not really, other than paying out settlements, and generally they don't admit any fault when they do that. So no, I mean, I think a lot of people like to believe that the police department is better now, that there's more accountability for police, especially after, um, you know, in the last few years, there's been a lot of problems with the police department in San Francisco. They had a racist texting scandal. They had the shooting of Mario Woods, who had a knife but didn't appear to be threatening officers when he was shot and killed, and other um, uh, young black men and men of color who have been killed by the police. It has led to reforms during the Obama administration. The police department had did a voluntary kind of collaborative review of its policies and practices and agreed to implement several reforms, and the department's still working on implementing them.
Wow. Well, was there anything else in your story that you say you weren't able to include, but you'd like to talk about right now?
Uh, yes. Well, I didn't get a chance to mention that, Caldwell got this $8 million settlement from the city, but he's still fighting to get compensated by this state board. There's the California Victims Compensation Board. They're responsible for helping victims of crime, but they all are also tasked with compensating people who are exonerated, who spent time in prison for crimes they did not commit. And a few years ago, this board denied Caldwell's, request for compensation. It awards, I don't remember the exact amount, but I think it's over $100 a day for every day someone's in prison wrongfully. And his payout would be over $1 million because he spent over 20 years. And uh, they denied his claim based on, I guess, a finding that he wasn't found factually innocent because his conviction was overturned based on a ineffective assistance of counsel. But I talked to his lawyer, his prior lawyer who got his conviction overturned at the Northern California Innocence Project. And she said the law has since been changed as far as how exonerated people are compensated by this board. And there's kind of a lower burden of proof now. So Caldwell's lawyer told me he's still appealing that decision. He hasn't told me that the appeal has been filed yet, but he's planning to appeal that decision and still seek compensation from this victims compensation board. Um, Zachary Vanderhorst, I need to actually follow up with him because I don't know if he's tried to go that route and seek compensation from that board, but he certainly should. So I'm going to talk to him after this.
Yeah.
Um, as far as Zachary's case, the one thing I didn't get to mention that his lawyer Rebecca Young, who she recently left the public defender's office. Now she works for the district attorney's office, investigating police misconduct and police shootings. But she really emphasized kind of how bad things were in the 1970s, not only with the police, but also with the public defender's office, that they kind of just were much more interested in closing cases than, serving their clients. They were kind of overwhelmed. They had a lot of cases, every public defender had a lot of cases to handle. And, she thinks that's what contributed to them basically not even trying to investigate Zachary's, alibi and trying to build up a defense for him. They just pushed him to take a plea deal. And she says the public defender's office has changed dramatically since then. Jeff Adachi took over the public defender's office decades ago. He passed away a few years ago, but she says he was instrumental in turning around the public defender's office and making it more client focused. She said he hired a lot more support staff and paralegals to support the lawyers, um, so that they could more effectively, represent their clients.
I see. Well, final question for me. What are Mr. Vanderhorst and Mr. Caldwell? What are they up to today? How are they putting their lives together after, being released from prison and, fighting these fights to get the either the compensation or, like I said, just to put their lives back together.
Well, Caldwell lives in a suburb outside of Sacramento now. He has two children that he had after he got out of prison in 2011. So he told me that, he wants to use the settlement money he got to make sure his kids have a good life, a better life than he had growing up in the projects as a young man, and to help his sister and his family. Um, he said he wants to buy a house. Uh, you know, as far as Zachary Vanderhorst, when he got out of prison in February of 2020, right before the COVID-19 pandemic started, which is probably very unfortunate timing, right?
Yeah.
But he did he started working. He was working for, I believe, Urban Alchemy and some groups that provide services to the homeless and things like that. But he has actually had to stop working now because he developed really bad eyesight problems that started in prison, but got worse and worse. And he's trying to get, I think, some operation now to deal with that. But he's unable to work anymore because of his eyesight. So, and he's living with his sister in Oakland. Um, but I met up with him a few weeks ago to take some photos of him at his near where he grew up, and he seemed to be in pretty good spirits and look um, very healthy. Uh, I will say one thing when in talking with Zachary, I mean, you'll hear in the piece if you listen to it that he cried a lot during our conversation, which was, you know, difficult for me to, you know, deal with. It was so, emotional, but he just comes across as someone who's very kind and gentle. And it's hard to believe that he could have ever been accused of killing someone.
Mm. Yeah, that definitely does come through with the piece, and I think you did a wonderful, very fantastic job of this reporting. I think this is a very essential story, so thank you very much for all you did to tell this story. Any final words before we wrap up?
No, I hope people will listen to the podcast episode if they haven't yet. And I hope that people will keep telling these stories because they're important.
Absolutely. Yes. And if you have not listened to the podcast episode yet, or if you have, and maybe you have a friend who has not listened to it or subscribed or left a really good review, anything like that, please, you can find it on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, as well as YouTube. And of course, follow Sidebar CNS on Twitter and Courthouse News on Twitter for all of our latest work and everything else to come. So thank you so much for today, Nick.